We won't say nothing. Good afternoon, everybody. We want to welcome you to the services here at Lake Norman this evening. I know we have a lot of things going on. Please remember to look at the prayer list that comes out every Thursday that Dennis and Arlene put together. Please look forward to that, and just think about those folks who are needing prayers right now. We know that we have some in our family here that are fighting the virus and stuff like that, so we want to keep all of those guys in our prayers. We do want to keep Karen Helms, who is Martha Hager's daughter. She lost her husband last week, and please continue to keep them in your prayers. And if you can, reach out to them and just encourage them. They could really use that at this time. Mr. Cade's going to lead us in a prayer in just a second. Then Ricardo has the song. And Thomas, finally, how many times have you had to cancel now? 2 or 3 times. Finally, Mr. Thomas will will bring our devotional, and then Howard has the adult class tonight. So we'll go ahead and get started. Cade?
Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for bringing us here tonight to gather together and worship your name. Lord, I ask you to be with us and help us to put away the worldly distractions and focus upon your name as we hear a lesson from your word and sing songs about your praise. Lord, I ask that you please forgive us our many sins. Lord, I ask you to be with those that are sick and injured, be with the doctors and nurses that look after them. Lord, I ask you to be with those that are fighting the virus. Lord, I ask you to keep a hand over them and help them to get back to health. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Good evening. From time to time, or perhaps quite frequently, You and I feel the tug of the world. We feel the pull, the allure of the world. And maybe you're thinking, I've tried this Christianity thing for a little while, maybe with different results than expected. And while you're not about to just give up on your faith and sell out wholesale, maybe you're thinking that there's a few areas that it would just be a lot easier if you weren't quite such a stickler on those things, or if you just compromised a little bit. Maybe not big things, just small things. Maybe perceived rules and boundaries feel constraining. Perhaps it feels draining to always try to be something that you just don't feel like you are. And perhaps in weak moments, a former lifestyle or past habits look suddenly very appealing. And so you kind of decide not to worry about some of these things quite so much. Just let them slide a little bit. Small things. That's where it starts. But it never stops there. No one will notice. You tell yourself, what harm could it possibly be? After all, I'll be a good influence on them. I don't think they'll rub off on me too much. Or we'll say something like, yeah, but at least I'm not as bad as him. He should really get his act together. And things like, you don't really expect me to be perfect, do you? And before we know it, we're not the person we used to be. And we're no longer compromising on small things, but on big things. Cookie, anyone? I'm not an expert at many things, but I think throughout my childhood I was pretty close to being an expert at getting into the cookie jar and out with the cookie pretty quietly. It was a glass jar, and that little tinkling sound made all the difference. You had to get the lid back on just right. Sometimes we feel the pull, the draw of the world, things that we've given up, things we've renounced, but we still have a desire for them, maybe even stronger than we'd like to admit. The problem is we're masters at self-deception. You see the pawn on the screen? It thinks it's a king. The shadow is the shadow of a king chess piece, but it's just a pawn. The truth is we never beat the devil when we try to play him at his own game. And sometimes we act like we don't believe in the law of compound interest. We all believe in the law of compound interest when it comes to the world of finances. Some people believe in it because it works for them. Other people believe in it because it works against them. But we all recognize that that's a thing. But the spiritual law of compound interest is very similar. If you do a small good thing now, it becomes easier to do a small good thing in the future. If you do a small bad thing in the present, it becomes easier to do a small bad thing in the future. And if you do enough small good things in the present, it becomes easier to do a large good thing in the future. And if you do enough small bad things in the present, it becomes easier to do a large bad thing in the future. It's the law of spiritual compound interest. Sin will always take us further than we want to go, keep us longer than we want to stay, and cost us a whole lot more than we want to pay. Our life is not merely a product of a few big choices, who we marry, where we go to school, and where we live. It's the product of hundreds and thousands of small choices that by degree, by just a little bit, shape us into who we become over the course of a lifetime. We mustn't forget to take care of the small things in our life and to pay attention to those small things that add up over time. We can bargain with sin for an inch, but sin will always take a mile or more. James 1 says it this way, "Be doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves. If anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he's like a man observing his natural face in a mirror. He observes himself, goes away, and immediately forgets what kind of man he was." And so self-deception is a real thing, and a scary thing at that. What if a car mechanic walked out of his shop, looked in the mirror? Kate, you probably know something about this. You know, you're working on the car, right? You get greasy, you get the oil from the engine, whatever, on you. What if you looked in the mirror and said, I look ready for a business interview, right? That would be kind of silly to not recognize your condition. But it's so easy to do that spiritually, to look in the mirror, to look in the Word, and not see the things that need to be different in our life. We rationalize it away, we hide it, we sweep it under the rug. But Peter uses very strong language for going back to the world. He says it's like a sow that's been washed, a pig that's been washed, goes right back to the mud. I remember at a lot of plantation one time, we saw some massive hogs rooting around in the mud. And it was a little bit fascinating to observe this big animal up close, but it was mostly just repulsive to see that thing, basically eating mud and just in the mud. Very, very disgusting. So that's the imagery that Peter uses to talk about what it's like if we turn away from our faith and go back to the world. So we feel that pull, that allure of the world. What is needed to combat it? When we read through the Gospels, we see that Jesus had an active, personal, devotional life. And if Jesus had an active, personal, devotional life, how much more do you and I need the same thing? In Mark chapter 1, it says, "Now in the morning, having risen a long while before daylight, he went out and departed to a solitary place. There he prayed." It's active. He's doing something that doesn't happen by accident. He got up early in the day and went to a place to pray. And it's personal. This is just him and the Father. This is, of course, in addition to synagogue worship that he's participating in. And for us, our active personal devotional life is in addition to worship, but it needs to be personal as well. And that wasn't a one-time event. Luke tells us in Luke 5, he often withdrew into the wilderness and prayed. It was something he did repeatedly, not just once or twice. So what if we don't feel like having that personal devotional life? It's hard to manufacture feelings of devotion if you don't feel it. Let me suggest using the Psalms in your devotional life. There's a psalm for just about every occasion, I'm convinced. Perhaps you're feeling reflective. You're thinking about life in general, the course of your life. Psalm 1 is great. "How blessed is the man who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked, nor stand in the path of sinners, nor sit in the seat of scoffers. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law he meditates day and night." Perhaps you're outdoors, observing nature, and Psalm 19 is a great one to read. It says, the heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. It's great to be outdoors and see the skies. I was at a state park earlier this fall, and in the space of about 30 minutes, I saw 3 shooting stars. That's a great psalm to have in your mind. Perhaps you need comfort. The 23rd Psalm is a classic for a reason. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He restores my soul," and so forth. Perhaps we feel like we need to confess and repent something. Psalm 51, "Have mercy upon me, O God, according to your steadfast mercy. Blot out my transgressions. Create in me a clean heart." That's a good psalm to read or pray through. Perhaps we want to worship. Either we're in a worshipful attitude at the congregation, in church, or perhaps in our private devotional lives. Psalm 95 is great. We have at least 2 songs that come from that psalm. "Come, let us sing for joy to the Lord. Let us shout aloud to the rock of our salvation. Come, let us worship and bow down. Let us kneel before the Lord, our God, our Maker. For he is our God, and we are the people of his pasture and the sheep of his hand." Or if you're feeling thankful, 107th Psalm has a beautiful chorus that appears either 3 or 4 times. It says, "Oh, that men would give thanks to the Lord for his goodness to the children of men and for his wonderful works to the sons of men." There's a psalm for just about every occasion. These psalms have been read, sung, and prayed by God's people for decades and centuries. We also should read, sing, and pray through these psalms and learn to love them. I'm in the market for a car right now. And I guess I've always known this intuitively, but it feels a little different now. Cars are expensive, and I'm searching for used cars, not a new car. New cars are even more expensive. But you know what? The most expensive car is worthless compared to my soul, compared to your soul. There is in Davidson, if I remember correctly, a 6-bedroom, 5-bath, 16,000 square foot home on about 60 acres. That home, as gorgeous and beautiful and huge as it is worthless beside one soul. Consider the worth of your soul. And remember that those who play with fire will get burned. I should know because I, in my childhood, have displayed some pyromaniacal tendencies. There was one time in particular, two of my brothers, whom shall remain unnamed, the three of us had a minor space race. We set boundaries for what would qualify as a win. Basically, the first person to build a hot air balloon that could float a certain number of feet above the ground for a certain amount of time would win. Well, I had a hot air balloon with an open flame at the bottom, and we had to have it tethered, but you want the tether to weigh as little as possible. My tether was silk thread, very, very light. Also not a good combination with fire. My hot air balloon goes up a few feet and promptly burns the tether, and now my hot air balloon is floating away with fire. And thankfully I didn't burn the whole neighborhood down that day. But those who play with fire will get burned. I've gotten burned several times playing with fire in my childhood. Those who flirt with sin do so to the destruction of their own soul. And so we mustn't give the devil even the smallest foothold. Rock climbers can climb a wall of rock that to me looks smooth, but they find small finger holds and footholds, and they can climb it like a ladder. So we mustn't give the devil even the smallest foothold. It's been observed that the best time to plant a tree is 30 years ago, so that you can enjoy its shade today. But if you didn't plant the tree, today is the second best time to plant that tree. And so here's how I plan to respond to this message. And Cade knows about this because I asked Cade this week to help me out by checking with me each day to see if I'm spending time in the Word the way I know I ought to be doing. Now is the time to invest in an active, personal, devotional life. Who knows, but a dry season might be coming, which would make use of this time even more important for our growth. As Rob Morey has said to me several times, dig your well, dig it deep, and dig it now. God has equipped us with everything we need to stay the course and keep unspotted from the world. That's what James says in James 1:27. He says, pure and undefiled religion before God and the Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their trouble, and to keep oneself unspotted from the world. Your soul is priceless. Take care of it.
Thank you. You have your Bibles, turn to the 21st chapter of Acts. We're going to pick up in the 27th verse. Am I on? Yeah? Can you hear it? There we go. How's that? 27th verse. I think when I was teaching last week for John, and I didn't know I was going to teach again today, but I suggested to you to read the defenses or presentations that Paul makes in Acts, the 9th chapter. He talks about, and it's being talked about for him in terms of Luke, about his conversion. And then he repeats it himself in the 22nd chapter as well as the 26th chapter. That is, Paul repeats it. And they're a little bit different. They're different because, anyone? Why would they be different?
Context.
What was that?
Context.
Well, the context, but what is it? The audience. There we go. Different audience. Luke is writing for Theophilus, who he's writing the whole book of Acts, and as well as Luke too. He's writing it to Theophilus, and he's saying this is what happened. 9th chapter of Acts. Paul, on the other hand, is addressing whom when he here? Both the 22nd and the 26th chapter. Not Gentiles, but there's only one other group, so it can't be that hard. Jews. Okay. The Israelites here, well, really Jews here. Paul is addressing them. And you can see that in his presentation and the way he utilizes the verbiage. And I'm going to try to point some of those things out for you, but you need to be looking at those details. And I think I did send off an email this week. I don't know if anybody got to see it. I did. Okay. I was making certain it went off. And he addresses and uses terms like for Ananias than what's used in the 9th chapter. In the 9th chapter, it really talks about him being a disciple. And you can clearly tell that. He doesn't say that about Ananias in the 22nd and 26th chapter. What he says about Ananias is what? A man of God. A man well known by the Jewish people around him. And he's trying to get the audience to relate to him as he's making this communication to them. Now, we'll get into some more details of that, but those are the kinds of things. There's a half a dozen items in each of those that I won't even mention all of them and we go through, but you can find them yourself. That's why they're different. And Luke does something else here as he's writing this. He builds this thing up so that you don't really get all the details until you look in the 26th chapter and get the final presentation. So Luke is sort of adding to it from details, in this case from Paul himself, to try to emphasize the whole presentation that Paul is making, that he's adding more to it. Understand this, it was extraordinarily difficult to write something in the first century. You had a minimal amount of materials. They didn't have copying machines then, by the way. And ink pens didn't come easily. You had to work your way around those. When you repeated something on a text, anytime you see it repeated, it was extraordinarily important. Well, in effect, Luke writes it 3 times here, and so there's a reason for it. He's trying to get the point across of what he's trying, of the whole presentation. So, again, extraordinarily important. So when you read something like this, and you see it 3 times, you see it 2 times, go back and re-look at it and look at either the differences or what the point is trying to be made here. That makes sense to everybody? Yeah, there we go. Now, having said that as an introduction, do we have questions to start with, or we just sort of, wow, I don't know anything, Howard, so I'm not going to say anything? Okay. I'll presume that you know everything, and we'll just review some of this stuff. How's that sound? All right. Yeah, let's start picking it up in the 27th. And I'm reading the NIV version. If you have a different version, it uses something a little bit different in the vocabulary, let me know. Raise your hand, because generally I'm familiar with most of the versions, and we can address them. I use the NIV because it's simple, and I was raised on the King James Version, in case you're interested. And the only way to read Psalms, by the way, is the King James Version. It still is. It's something special. It just flows. There's something neat about it. But anyway, okay, let's begin it on the 27th verse. Now, remember some of the things that Paul has just delivered his gifts to from the Gentile churches to Jerusalem, and they're starting to have some issues, and they ask him to, in effect, to take a vow, and we went through that. You'll find the vow, I think I told you, is in Numbers, the 6th chapter, something or another, if you want to look that up. Now, in the 27th verse. When the 7 days are nearly over, that vow that he took, I think I told you last week, usually is 30-some-odd days. There's a short one. And I won't go into all the details because it's not overly relevant right now. And the short one is, how long? 7 days. See, I don't ask hard questions. They're really simple. You don't have to be overly concerned. Yeah, there's the short one, 7 days. One of the difficulties about it is you had to go into the temple a couple of times. Well, given what's going on and all Paul's problems or whatever, for him to show up a couple of times was asking for a lot of trouble. And it so happens that they that he runs into it here. When the 7 days were nearly over, some Jews from the province of Asia saw Paul at the temple because he was trying to complete his vow. They stirred up the whole crowd and seized him, shouting, "Fellow Israelites, help us. This is the man who teaches everyone everywhere against our people and our law in this place. And besides, he brought Greeks into the temple and defiled this holy place." And they had previously seen Trophimus, the Ephesian in the city, where Paul assumed that he brought him in. Well, so right away we see the difficulty. First place, we have people following Paul around for some reason or another. To go all the way to Jerusalem from Ephesus is not just a short distance. So they had difficulties in Ephesus, right? Where they had the uproar in Ephesus and etc. And they were probably as much trouble with it as they are here too. So they challenged that Paul was the troublemaker, that he had brought a Gentile into the temple. We know from history, first of all, Josephus tells us about it. And Josephus tends to get a little overexcited, but he wrote approximately 80 AD, just for your information. And we know that there were signs put up outside the temple and said, you know, if you're a Gentile and you come into the inner courts, you're going to get killed. Well, I'm not sure how much of that was just sort of a projection that things might be bad. But during this period of time, where we have a lot of people trying to raise issues against the Roman government and create all kinds of problems for the Roman government as well as themselves, they were looking for just a minimal excuse, and they were certainly looking for an excuse to attack Paul. And so what do? Now, there were how many people, if you read this passage, how many people had done the Nazarite vow with Paul? I'll answer that question. 3 others. So that becomes 4. And so if you saw Paul going into the temple at the same time of the 7 days, the other ones came through at the same time, and they automatically assumed that one of them had to be a Gentile from Ephesus. Or they didn't even assume that. They were just making that projection in order to irritate the people and get this kind of resurrection against Paul, get it started. I don't know, maybe he looked like some of the others, 2 or 3. Whatever the reason, they utilized this as a methodology to attack Paul. And they were getting everybody uproared, which apparently didn't take very much. And we'll see that's why the Romans built a watchtower almost on top of the temple. It was at the northwest corner of it. It wasn't in the temple by any means. They wouldn't do that. But it was close enough that they could run over there to it. Antonio is the name that they called it, but in any case, it's close. And they had a sizable amount of military people there. The commander here, or the tribune, had approximately 1,000 people that reported to him. It was a good number that was there. Seems to me like it's like 300 and some odd that could get on a horse, and the other 700 were infantry. So there's a sizable amount of military presence. And it tells you again the difficulties that were taking place in Jerusalem and the surrounding area to have that kind of a military active, ready to do something in case anything occurs, any kind of riots, any kind of other difficulties. And we'll see when we get down to it, there was at least one not too long before this. So they were ready to pounce the minute that anybody started problems. I think I told you last week that Felix, who was the governor at this point in time, was one of the worst governors they'd had in a long time. And his answer was to kill somebody first and then ask questions. And he got so bad that even Nero said, you know, enough of that. Send Festus in and take care of it. Well, Festus ended up lasting a couple of years only. So the time period of this is I don't know, 55 AD to maybe 57, 58 AD, and Festus takes over for a couple of years after that. And unfortunately, Festus was an extraordinarily good governor, by the way, from the political thing that we can pick up, but he ended up dying. So, the good they die young or something like that. Anyway, Festus croaks in a couple of years, and then thereafter they had all kinds of problems, and then that's when they went into, and they might have had it regardless who was governor. And that's when they went into to revolt, AD 66, till the Romans stopped it in AD 70, and for approximate time. So the period of time is in turmoil on a constant basis. Constant. Over and over and over again, almost anything could cause problems. And that's what we're running into here. And so let's go on to the 30th verse. The whole city was aroused. Now that might be a little bit of a hyperbole, but everybody was upset. Everybody heard about it, etc. And the people came running from all directions, anything to have a riot, if you want, okay? Seizing Paul, they dragged him from the temple, and immediately the gates were shut while they were trying to kill him. News reached the commander, which was a tribune of the Roman troops, that the whole city of Jerusalem was in an uproar. He at once took some officers. By the way, this looks like two centurions when he uses this kind of verbiage. I don't know what you've got text there, but the Greek implies two centurions who in and of themselves have 100 people each. So they're going into this thing with a great deal of military force, and they weren't going to take any chances. I'm sure that Felix said, if they start something, do something about it and do it quickly. And took some officers and soldiers and ran down to the crowd. And when the rioters saw the commander and the soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. We're lucky that Paul was able to get out of this mess, at this point. There's something to pick up on here. This was Paul's last trip to the temple. He doesn't make it back to the temple again, period. Questions, etc. Now, what was the name of the commander? Do we know? The tribune? That's not a fair question, is it? You'll find the answer in the 23rd chapter, if you want to look it up. Lysisus is Claudius is his first name. Probably a reason for that. We'll talk about that in a moment. At any rate, here the commander is, and you'll find it in 23rd. Came up and arrested him and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. Does that mean 2 chains? No. The Greek would imply that he's got 2 separate chains, and so he's chained up with 2 different soldiers. Is how that they would do that. That's what it's talking about when it says 2 chains. Okay? Well, that kept him from getting away and doing anything else. He's chained to 2 soldiers. Okay. Arrested him in order to be bound with 2 chains. Yeah. Then he asked who he was and what he had done, and some in the crowd shouted one thing and some another. And since the commander couldn't figure out to get at the truth, because of the uproar, he ordered that Paul be taken back to the barracks. When Paul reached the steps, the violence of the mob, by the way, that's a special word that only Luke uses, and it really means violence in the worst possible thing you can think of. They were rioting. They were trying to torture Paul. That kind of verbiage you need to pick up on when it says violence. It wasn't just they were upset. It was serious violence here. The mob was so great he had to be carried by the soldiers. So basically, they're getting them up, getting them away from the people, and they're carrying him. The two soldiers that have him chained are carrying him out, and you've got several hundred soldiers there to make certain that happens. And what do they say? The crowd that followed kept shouting, "Get rid of him." And we see the same thing in Ephesus, where they talk about it, and they really mean let's kill him. That's and the Ephesians and Acts 19 in the Ephesian riot. Acts 19 takes place, and they use the same kind of verbiage. Let's get rid of him. We would rather have him killed, etc. For that. Comments, questions? Anybody?
Ephesus was more that he got, as I understand it, he was messing with the business negotiations of the idol goers. Here it's a religious reaction. I don't know if you can say that or not. But it's the same thing happens. One's for religion.
Well, the Jews had got upset too, and of course they were part of, and they were there at Ephesus. And yeah, it was a business decision somewhat in Ephesus. But again, they were trying, they were just trying to kill Paul. Going to stop this thing. Now then, where are we at? Oh, at verse 37. I'm not going to get very far. As the soldiers were about to take Paul into the barracks, what did he ask them? He's walking in the barracks. There's a riot out beside him. Claudius is trying to get this thing taken care of. He's going to take him back and beat the daylights out of Paul till Paul tells him what's going on. And what does Paul start to do? Preach? No, not quite. He stops Claudius, the commander, and then asks him what? He wants to preach. He's asking, can I talk to him? Now, if you're Ricardo and you're trying to arrest somebody and there's a group of people that's screaming and yelling at him, and this guy you're arresting takes away, and you're taking him away, and he says, "Can I talk to all these people that's in this riot?" Ricardo's got good sense, and he says no. Why didn't the Claudius here say no to Paul? He wanted to know what he had to say, but he could always find that out when he takes him back to the barracks and beats the daylights out of him. Okay. What happens here is Claudius thinks he's the Egyptian that had caused problems in the past. This Egyptian, by the way, had caused a lot of problems in the past. He'd gotten a group together. Josephus says it's thousands. Luke tends to make the number a little more reasonable, like 4,000. Anyway, he brought a whole bunch of people into Jerusalem. Now, this happened probably 57, 58. So we're talking about it just, like yesterday. Certain Claudius remembers it as happened yesterday. And the Egyptian says, I am going to bring down the walls of Jerusalem, very similar to the walls of Jericho. And I'm going to do this because I'm God's Messiah. And you guys want to follow me because if I'm the Messiah, I've got all the answers. Now, you can get a lot of details about the Egyptian, and you can read it. Josephus tells us a lot about it. It's not overly important here. But he had caused enough problem. So he gets into Jerusalem, get ready for the walls to fall down. And they don't, of course. But at this point, Felix says, I've had enough. I'm going to preempt this thing. We're going to go in and grab all these people that's a part of this thing and execute them. And he executes hundreds of them. But he misses one. Who does he miss? The Egyptian. The Egyptian gets away. Despite all the stuff that's there and he's leading this whole mess, he gets away. and we never hear about him again. Probably went back to Egypt, I don't know. But Claudius knows about him because this guy caused all that trouble before, and he turns around, and he could really almost cause the same kind of problems. And that's what he says to Paul. But something kind of odd takes place here. What is it? Paul talks to him in Greek, fluent, by the way, and that shakes up Claudius right away. Now, why that happens is because they made the assumption that the Egyptian was just not educated, that he was really a problem, that he wouldn't possibly be able to speak Greek. Is that normal? No. The Egyptians could very well speak Greek. Where Philo was a famous philosopher as a Jew, he couldn't speak Hebrew or Aramaic, but he could speak Greek. It was an assumption made that the Egyptian was uneducated, and so he turns right around and finds that Paul says, hey, in perfect Greek, mine's not perfect anymore, maybe Thomas's is, but mine isn't, and he says, hey, can I speak to this crowd? Wow, I thought you were the Egyptian, and what if all the problems, I'm going to a lot of explanation here, what if all the problems could be cured right away if this crowd could understand that you're not the Egyptian, you're not the one causing all the problems, and if we could clear that up, my job's done. That's why Claudius allows Paul to stop and talk to him. That's why Ricardo's wouldn't do that. But maybe the same circumstances, he might consider it. But so you understand why he stops and says, why don't I address them? You're not the Egyptian. You're not the troublemaker. Yeah, why don't you tell them you're not the troublemaker, and everybody will be happy. That makes sense to you? Well, that's what happens here, and that's why the tribunal decides to try to allow Paul to talk to him. It wasn't because he wanted more of a problem. Now, Paul addresses them, doesn't he? But what does he do? He switches languages. Well, I'll skip through the 38 and get started on this thing. And 39. He addresses them. And he addresses them, it says Hebrew. Most of your text, I think, says that. Probably Aramaic is what he means. Because, why would that be important? Anybody? It's the local language. If he wanted to start talking in actual Hebrew, and he was capable of doing it, most of the crowd wouldn't have understood him. That's not what his point is here. So, yeah, he addresses them Aramaic. Now, what does he say? Good grief, Howard. John needs to be sick another Wednesday for me to finish this. And he begins here. And look at the way he begins. I am a Jew. I'm from Tarsus, a citizen of no ordinary city. Tarsus was probably 500,000 people. Tarsus was not a two-bit city. That's what this means. This is an important city. Certainly Ephesus falls in that kind of category. But Tarsus was a big city, a value city. Anthony had 100 years before this, during his whatever, made Tarsus a very important city because they helped him, etc. Please let me speak to these people. And after receiving, I've got ahead of myself, didn't I? All right, well, let's get down to the 22nd chapter, verse 1. Paul starts it out. Brothers and fathers, listen now to my defense. And again, he's trying to get the audience to sort of go along with him. They heard him speak in Aramaic. NIV uses Aramaic. They become extraordinarily quiet. And they didn't expect this. And so they're sitting down and cooling off a little bit. I am a Jew born in Tarsus, brought up in this city. This city being what? Jerusalem. Yeah. I studied under Gamaliel and was thoroughly trained in the law of the ancestors. Where else do we pick up Gamaliel? In Acts, for example. When we pull in the disciples and they say, don't start, you've got a big mess here on your hands, but before they do that, before they decide what they want to do with them, Gamaliel gives them a thoughtful kind of direction. You know, if this happens to be from God, you or the rest of us isn't going to do anything about it. If it isn't from God, then it can be taken care of. So don't make a big deal out of it. You can see why Gamaliel had some brains, although his son probably didn't, because he was part of the revolt that takes place in AD 66, by the way. His son was one of the leaders of it, much to his problems. So, but Gamaliel was a famous teacher, well respected, very difficult to get involved with. You had to have some money to go to school. He was the Harvard of Jewish training. It's that kind of background, Paul says. Not only am I a Jew, not only am I from Tarsus, but I was trained. I lived here in Jerusalem, and we know that because he has family there, don't we? Eventually we run into it that his nephew gets him out of hot water. But you have to get into 23rd, 24th chapter. But he says, I am a Jew. I've been trained here. I lived among you. I'm a part of you. I've been trained by one of your very best teachers, etc. Okay, great start. Audience, I need you listening to me. I want to be a part of. Do I have your attention? Have you calmed down enough to use your brains? That's what all this is about. Goes on for a while. I was just as zealous for God as any of you are today. Persecuted the followers of the way to their death, arresting both men and women and throwing them into prison. And guess who he looks for witnesses? What does it say in that next verse, the 5th verse? High priest and all the council can themselves testify. I even obtained letters from them and their associates in Damascus, and I went there to bring these people as prisoners to Jerusalem to be punished. Paul showing his credentials as being, you know what? I was a tough Jew. I believed in it. I was doing what I thought God wanted me to do. And to verify that, go ask the high priest. I doubt if any of them ever talked to the high priest, which is exactly his point. I mean, the high priest wasn't readily available to everybody. It'd be like, when's the last time you talked to our President of the United States? That's the kind of thing it would be. Oh, well, I don't. But you have letters. I have letters from the President of the United States. I talked to him. Oh, okay, that makes you pretty important. That's what his thought process is here. You are very important. You've gotten something from the high priest. You had a job to do for the high priest and the council, and you wandered off and did it in Damascus. He came into Damascus and then on his way. Now, of course, having read the 9th chapter, we know what this is about, but there's some differences here. I came to Damascus, suddenly a bright light from heaven flashed around me. I'm losing part of it. I fell to the ground, heard a voice say to me, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? That's somewhat the same as in the 9th chapter. The bright light, a little bit different. Did he see a light in the 9th chapter? Yes. But the kind of terminology that he uses here shows us that it's even brighter light than what was explained in the chapter 9. You can go back and look at that. And who are you, Lord? I asked. I am Jesus of Nazareth. If you look at the 9th chapter, that doesn't say that. Why does he point it out here? He's trying to get the Jews to realize that he's a Jew. He's trying to get them to understand that his mission was from God, which is all right. This happens to all of them. And he identifies the person, or Jesus, if you will, as being what? A Jew. He's from Nazareth. He's down in the city. He's not very far. Well, Nazareth's a little bit of a hike from Jerusalem, but not much. And unless you go through Samaria, it's even closer. But anyway, that's why he used the term here. That's why he says, Jesus was from Nazareth. He's from one of your home cities, So why are you getting upset about it? Again, pulling the audience into him, identifying with his Jewish roots, if you will, and getting him to understand that what he was doing was for God as a Jew. And my companions saw the light, but they did not understand the voice of him who was speaking to me. It's a comprehension kind of thing. If you read the 9th chapter, I've forgotten what it says. Heard the sound, but did not see anybody. That's all it says about it in the 9th chapter, verse 7. But here it said they didn't understand the voice. They didn't understand the comprehension aspect of it. They just heard a noise of him who was speaking. And then Paul says, anytime anyone, and us included, I suspect, if we hear this kind of voice coming at us, we know it's from where? Or we think it's from where? Heaven. Divine. We may not know the source, but my goodness, if something's talking to you, it's divine. And they certainly believed that. If it came from, outside of that, they certainly accepted the fact that it was from heaven. That it was very important. And you didn't just ignore God. And Paul certainly didn't. He reacts to it right away. And because of the brilliance of the light had blinded me. Again, that's implied in 9, but not really said. Here Paul clearly makes a point that it's there. And again, divine presence is basically a good way to put this. Now, let's talk about Ananias for a moment. A man named Ananias came to see me. He was a devout observer of the law. Not said in the 9th chapter. It talks about him being a disciple, follower of Christ, etc., etc. But Paul is identifying something different. He was a devout observer of the law and highly respected by all the Jews living there. All of which is true. But again, he is getting the audience to try to understand the Jewishness of this presentation. You need to be listening to me. Now, eventually he gets into something a little bit more that gets him into trouble. But here he's trying to say, sit down, listen to me calmly. And he stood by me and said, Brother Saul, receive your sight. And at that very moment, I was able to see him. Comments, questions? Make sense to you? Mike? Yeah. Most importantly, he's trying to get him to calm down to the hearing, just to listen to it. Don't get so uptight about what you think I might have done and whatever. Realize that I'm coming at you. I was a Jew. I was etc., etc. Yeah, Doc.
Well, even before that, he could have pulled another card. He could have said he was a Roman and these guys are beating me up. to undergo this. But he went the tough route. He made a choice not to use his Roman citizenship to speak to these people. And sometimes we run away. We don't take the tough road. We take the easy road. I'm an American. You can't mess with me.
Well, since you brought it up, and I'm running out of time anyway, let's address that issue a little bit. It's a little more than that. What if this group had been so upset about was him bringing a Gentile into the temple? And they hated the Romans. Remember the kind of culture that you're at. They've had nothing but conflict in these last few years. They had the Egyptians come marching in there. They had other people that were claiming it. They had insurrections on a regular basis. They absolutely hated the Romans, particularly Romans that had a 1,000 army next door to the temple. They hated it with a passion. What if he had come right out and said, okay, guys, I want you to settle down and listen to me. I'm a Roman and you can't do that. What would have happened? Hey, come unglued. He would have got 5 words out of his mouth. It would have been a disaster. So instead, he turns back. In the first place, he's talking to him in Aramaic, and undoubtedly the tribune probably couldn't even speak Aramaic. And so he's standing there and saying, yeah, okay, keep talking to him. They've calmed down. He doesn't know what he's saying, and we know that because eventually when you get in the latter part of it, they get upset again, and he starts to get him beat. I want to know what was going on. I want to know what he said, etc., etc. But the important thing, aspect of it, he doesn't make that claim to be a Roman citizen until the time is right to do it. He is trying to project, and I'll end it here, I guess, because I don't have any more time. He's trying to project enough of an audience so they can accept the gospel. That's his objective. It isn't trying to protect himself or any of the rest of the things. He's trying to project the fact that I want to talk to you about the gospel of Jesus Christ. I want to talk to you about the real Messiah. And he gets in to try to do that. Now, and so I'll have to quit. But where it looks like he's just about got him, he starts in to do what? Okay, I was sent out to the synagogue. That's all right. Glad you went to the synagogue and talked about the gospel a new way, and maybe that's important. And then they reject him, is what he says at this passage. And where does he go? To the Gentiles. Look what happens about within one word of that. They absolutely come unglued. Yeah, he went to the Gentiles. That's why he keeps bringing them into our temple. Kill him, you know. And they go off on it. And so I got to stop. Read the rest of this chapter, as well as the other chapters, and look at what he does when he gets in there. He very politely says to Claudius, well, actually it was one of the centurions, you know, you're about to beat me. And they had a special kind of whip to do this, by the way. It was on a wooden wall and thongs that had rocks or bones in them, sometimes metal, but they didn't find metal that easily, but bones in it. And that's what they were going to beat him with. And he said, you always do this to a citizen of Rome? Oh, my goodness. Why did they get upset? Why were they scared? After all, they're the police. They could have been, that was a criminal act, just like some of the things we keep pushing on the police today. That was a criminal act to have done to a Roman citizen. Cicero writes something to bind a Roman citizen is atrocious, to flog him is unacceptable, and if you kill him, that you will be liable for murder and will kill you. Cicero writes that. Period. A Roman citizen was extraordinarily important during the Roman power play. It wasn't just okay. Now, how did Paul prove that he was a citizen? Well, I was going to tell you about all that, and I'm out of time, so you'll have to wait and or send me a note and I'll answer it.